The first thing the miners noticed was the smoke, not from a chimney, not from the log cabins clinging to the lower slope like the last few teeth in a jaw that had taken decades of hard weather. The smoke rose from the ridge, thin, pale, almost colorless, against the October sky, out of a rusted freight rail car that had been sitting dead on an abandoned spur above Sierra Pass since the railroad company dissolved in 1882. 6 years of nobody. 6 years of snow pressing its sides each winter of summer heat, buckling its iron floor until the steel groaned like something alive, still trying to remember what movement felt like. Now there was smoke coming from a pipe that had not existed on that roof yesterday morning. Walt Corbett stood at the edge of camp with his coffee going cold in his hand, watching that thin thread rise into the hard October sky. He was 55, built like a man who had spent his whole life arguing with mountains, never winning the argument outright, but lasting long enough that the mountain eventually moved on to someone else. His beard was the color of iron filings. His knuckles were cracked at every joint regardless of season. He had managed this camp through 3 Sierra winters, had seen men arrive half frozen from the pass road, had watched them leave broken or carrying more gravel than gold. He had cataloged a great many kinds of strange up here above 6,000 feet. He had not seen smoke from that railcar before. Pruitt, 22 years old, came to stand beside him. Pruitt was at the age when most inexplicable things still resolved into simple explanations if you waited long enough. "Somebody got in there," he offered. Walt set his coffee on the post beside him without answering. He watched the smoke another minute, then turned back to the camp. Whatever was happening on that ridge was not his problem yet. In his experience, strange things that were not yet problems had a reliable tendency to become problems on their own schedule without any help from him. By the following morning, it was his problem. She had arrived on the stage from Truckee the previous afternoon. No wagon, no escort, no letter of introduction for anyone in camp. Just a woman somewhere in her middle years, moving with the specific quietness of someone who had already made every decision worth arguing about. Her coat was dark wool mended at both elbows, with careful, even stitches that didn't quite match the original color. Behind her walked a large gray herding dog, the size of a problem charcoal-coated level-eyed, with the bearing of a dog that had long ago decided most situations did not require its opinion unless asked. The stage driver had made her tie it to the running board for the last 4 miles. Neither the woman nor the dog had seemed particularly bothered by this arrangement. Her name was Agnes Merritt. She was 48 years old. The trunk she carried between herself and the dog held 3 wool blankets, a cast iron skillet, a roll of heavy canvas, a tin thermometer, a small leather journal with a spine crack from years of opening a coil of rope, a tin stove no larger than a hat box, a short-handled axe, a bag of flour, a bag of dried beans, 2 work dresses, a box of matches, leather work gloves worn smooth at the fingers, 2 lengths of iron pipe joined at the elbow, a box of wood screws, a small iron file, a folding ruler marked in 16ths, a bundle of pine needles tied with twine, a wool vest that had belonged to someone whose shoulders were broader than hers, a tin cup, a tin plate, a spoon, a knife with a 4-inch blade, a tallow candle, a compass. No money to speak of, no prior arrangements, no one expecting her. The miners who saw her cross the lower camp that first afternoon assumed she was passing through. People passed through, even in October, moving ahead of the season, with the particular anxiety of those who understood what the Sierra did to anyone who underestimated it. Agnes Merritt moved in the opposite direction. She moved up the slope above camp with the trunk balanced on her left shoulder, the rope in her right hand, Rex walking close at her left heel. The grade was steep enough that a man carrying half her load would have rested twice. She rested once for 30 seconds on a boulder halfway up, not setting the trunk down, just shifting its weight, breathing through her nose, then kept going. The rail car sat on a dead spur of track that ended in a wall of granite roughly 40 feet past the car's rear coupling. The spur had been laid in 1879 as a temporary staging platform for grading equipment. When the company dissolved, the equipment was pulled back down the mountain. The car, damaged in transit, deemed not worth the effort, was left behind. Its wheels had rusted solid to the rails. Its left side sliding door had swollen in its track and required a crowbar to shift. The interior was hollow, windowless, 40 feet of cold iron that smelled of old pine resin. Metal oxidation, something mineral, as if the mountain had begun digesting it from the inside out. Agnes stepped into the car through the right side door, which had lost its lower runner and hung crooked on its upper track. She walked the full length of the interior with one hand trailing along the iron wall boots, ringing against the floor, in a sound that died almost instantly in the cold air. No resonance, no echo, just the flat percussion of iron-absorbing impact. She walked to the far end 32 feet from the rear wall. She turned around. She looked at the 8 feet of space between where she stood and the rear wall of the car. She took the piece of charcoal from her coat pocket and drew a line across the floor. Rex sat just inside the doorway. His tail moved once settled. October was preparation. She descended the slope each morning before light and returned each evening with whatever she had salvaged from the abandoned grade, a quarter-mile east of the spur railroad ties, half buried under years of debris, scattered planks, iron spikes, a length of chain she might need. The ties she required were the deepest ones, waterlogged at their ends. Heavy the way saturated hardwood is heavy. Not just weight, but resistance. The wood fighting being moved from the position it had occupied long enough to forget it was ever supposed to move at all. She dragged them one at a time up the slope in the canvas sling rigged from the rope. Her palms blistered on the third day of hauling. She wrapped them in strips cut from the hem of one of the work dresses, pulled the gloves over the wrapping, kept going. Rex walked beside her on the uphill trips ahead of her on the downhill ones, pausing at intervals to look back and confirm she was still there. Walt Corbett climbed the ridge on a Tuesday in the second week of November. He came without announcing himself, not rudeness, simply the habit of a man who had learned that most conversations went better when the other person hadn't had time to prepare for them. He stood in the open doorway of the railcar and watched Agnes haul a railroad tie into position against the rear wall. She had already laid the first course of the bulkhead, 2 ties standing upright against the back wall. Flat faces turned inward, forming the outer layer of what she was building. Between those ties and the iron wall, she had packed a 6-inch cavity, dried pine needles pressed flat, then raw sheep's wool pulled from a thorn thicket in the lower pasture, then more pine needles, then another layer of wool. She had tested the cavity's compression by pressing her palm flat against the wool face and holding it there. It gave slightly under pressure, then held its shape. Resilient, not rigid. The kind of resistance that absorbed rather than deflected. She was positioning the second course now, the inner face of the bulkhead, a matching row of ties that would sandwich the insulation between 2 walls of dense hardwood. She drove iron spikes through both faces with measured blows, each strike locking the layers together without compressing the insulation between them. Walt watched for several minutes before speaking. His breath made clouds in the air that had already sharpened well past what October usually offered. The sky beyond the granite above the spur was the hard, specific blue that comes just before it stops being blue at all. "You planning to spend the winter up here?" It wasn't a question, exactly more a statement he was testing to see if it would be contradicted. Agnes straightened, looked at him once briefly, the way a person glances at something already cataloged. She went back to positioning the next spike. "Yes." Walt knocked his knuckle against the railcar wall. The sound rang out flat, dead, absorbed instantly by cold air. "Iron conducts cold the way a sponge conducts water. You'll be frozen before January." She wiped her hands on her coat and looked at what she'd built so far. "Not if I stop the cold before it reaches me." He didn't immediately answer. He looked at the bulkhead, at the 2 dense layers of hardwood, the packed insulation between them, at the heavy canvas she had already hung along the iron side walls inside the 8-foot space, suspended 1.5 inches off the metal surface by wooden pegs, so it floated without touching. The narrow channel between canvas and iron was invisible unless you looked specifically for it. Walt looked specifically for it. "You're trapping air," he said. Understanding arrived half a step behind his skepticism, which was its usual order of arrival. Agnes produced the folding ruler from her coat pocket. She checked the canvas gap at 3 points along the wall. "Air that doesn't move can't carry cold efficiently. The iron can be 30 below on the outside. If the air between the canvas and the wall stays still, the cold loses speed before it reaches me." She returned the ruler to her pocket. "Same principle as a double window pane. Dead space. Thomas called it dead air." "Thomas." She didn't expand on the name. Walt crossed his arms. He was a practical man. He didn't dismiss what he could observe working, but he didn't warm to it quickly either. He watched her pick up the short-handled axe and begin trimming a knot from the face of the next tie. After a moment, you can't outthink winter. That iron will steal heat from your bones the moment your fire goes cold. Agnes set the axe down. She looked at him with an expression that contained the structural elements of a smile without quite committing to one. I don't need to outthink winter. I just need to stop feeding it. Walt laughed once short, more air than sound. He shook his head, turned, climbed back down the ridge. That evening, he told Pruitt the widow on the spur was either a fool or something he didn't have a word for yet. Pruitt asked which seemed more likely. Walt poured his coffee and said nothing. The river stones required 4 days. Agnes found them in the creek bed below camp, round dense dark gray, shaped by moving water into something with the patience of deep time. She needed 40 each, roughly the size of 2 fists pressed together. She carried them up in the canvas sling 10 at a time, 4 trips down, 4 trips back, a total of perhaps 6 miles of walking, with 40 pounds over terrain that climbed 800 feet between the creek and the spur. By the second day, the blisters under her wrappings had broken. She didn't unwrap them to look. She stacked the stones in 2 rows of 20 beneath the sleeping platform she had constructed from salvaged planks, set on edge, raising the sleeping surface 14 inches above the floor. Cold air settles low, a fact she had absorbed from years in drafty farmhouses before she could have explained the thermodynamics behind it. Thomas had explained the thermodynamics later, sitting at a kitchen table in Reno, with his notebook open, a cup of coffee cooling beside his elbow. The air near the floor in any enclosed space is almost always the coldest. Anything you want to keep warm, you raise. Thomas Merritt had been a railroad engineer. Not the kind who drove the engines, the kind who determined where the tracks would go, how to cut a grade through granite at 6,000 feet without losing the crew that was doing the cutting. He had worked for 2 large companies before signing with a smaller one that sent him to Sierra Pass in the spring of 1885 to survey a new spur line off the main grade. He went out on a Tuesday morning in March to check a section showing movement in the survey stakes. Small shifts, the kind another engineer might have delegated. Thomas did not delegate things he was worried about. The talus gave way 40 minutes after he reached the site. They found him before dark, which was the part Agnes was supposed to be grateful for, and which she had eventually managed a complicated peace with. The 3 years since had been what a person's life becomes when the thing holding its shape is abruptly removed. She had moved Sacramento-Stockton briefly back to Reno, worked, stopped, started. She had lived 8 months with her sister until she understood that her sister's generosity had become a weight heavier than solitude. She had taken in sewing. She had sold the house. She had written letters she didn't send. She had burned one photograph and regretted it, kept another, and looked at it less often as the years passed. Not because the grief diminished, but because pressing on a bruise to confirm its existence eventually stopped serving any purpose. The morning Thomas left for the grade that final Tuesday, he had placed 2 envelopes on the kitchen table before going out. One was addressed to his foreman regarding a materials order. The other was addressed to Edmund, his younger brother, sealed with a note to Agnes on the outside, written in Thomas's careful block letters. "Send this if anything happens to me. You'll know when." Agnes had not known how to send it in those first weeks because Edmund had left for Colorado on a contract job the month prior, his forwarding address uncertain. By the time she had Edmund's address through a mutual acquaintance, nearly a year had passed. The acute rawness had transformed into something chronic, and Edmund had already made clear through other channels that he held her responsible in ways that made sending a dead man's letter feel like opening a door into a room where nothing good was waiting for either of them. She kept it in the bottom of the trunk under Thomas's journal. She had carried it for 3 years without making the decision not to send it, which was its own kind of decision. She had found the railcar's location in the company's survey records at the Sacramento Land Office in August of 1888. The notation read, "Abandoned spur Merit grade Sierra Pass, car number 44 derelict, no recovery value." Thomas had named the grade himself, as was standard practice for the engineer of record. She had known immediately that it was this one. She had not known until she stood inside it that first October afternoon, with her hand flat against the rear wall, and felt the cold iron under her palm, exactly what she intended to do here. She had thought in the vague, weather-like way that grief produces plans, that coming here might be a period, an ending, the last page of something. Instead, she had taken out the charcoal and drawn a line across the floor. The journal was the reason, not the only reason, but the largest. Thomas had been solving a problem in his spare hours for years before he died, How to keep railroad workers warm in high Sierra winters without the constant overhead of burning fuel that cost more to haul up than the labor justified. The solution existed in fragments throughout the journal entries about enclosed space, thermodynamics about the difference between ventilation that kept air breathable and ventilation that hemorrhaged warmth about the heat, retention capacity of dense stone versus the rapid heat loss of open flame. He had been building towards something specific. He had never had the occasion to build it. Agnes was his occasion. She completed the bulkhead on the 16th of November. 6 feet high, solid cornered, the outer and inner faces locked together with iron spikes driven through both layers of ties. She sealed every joint with a paste of flour ash water, not elegant, but effective. She caulked the gaps with a second application of wool pressed in with a flat stick. The candle flame she held at every seam held steady, which meant no drafts pulling through. Inside the 8-foot space, she hung the second canvas sheet along the iron side walls suspended off the metal. She fitted the tin stove into the corner, ran the horizontal section of pipe along the wall for 3 feet before turning it upward through the roof panel she had cut with the file. The horizontal run was specific. It gave the heat from combustion more time to transfer into the room air before escaping. She cut the vent hole high in the bulkhead 6 inches square, fitted with a sliding wooden baffle. A second opening at floor level in the bulkhead base covered with a wool flap completed the circuit. Warm air rose. Cooler air entered low. The room breathed without losing what it had worked to hold. She tested it on the evening of the 17th. 4 river stones heated in the outdoor fire for 2 hours transferred under the bed platform. 1 piece of hardwood the length of her forearm in the stove. A single match. 40 minutes later, the thermometer read 58 degrees. Outside it was 22. Rex thumped his tail once against the platform boards. Agnes looked at the thermometer for a long time, making certain she wasn't misreading it, making certain the satisfaction moving through her was warranted, which was a habit she had never been able to fully break. She went to sleep without feeding the stove again. At 3 in the morning, she woke and checked by candlelight. 54 degrees. She added 1 piece of wood, went back to sleep. By dawn, 58. Harriet Cole led the group of women from camp up the slope on a Friday afternoon near the end of November. She was 38, practical, with a directness that came from years of being the most organized person in any room she entered. She carried stew in a covered pot, still steaming. 3 other women came behind her, carrying the particular social discomfort of people who have come to say something difficult and are quietly hoping the difficulty might resolve before they have to say it. They stepped into the outer shell of the railcar. The air inside the outer chamber hit them immediately, barely warmer than the air outside, dimmed the iron ribs frosted at the corners. They stopped. The only light was a thin line around the edges of the inner door at the rear. Harriet knocked on the bulkhead with 2 knuckles. The wood returned a solid sound, dense, not hollow, the knock of something with substance behind it. The inner door opened. Warm air moved through the gap, first not aggressive, not the roaring heat of a stove fed past reason, but something steadier, more domestic, the warmth of a room that had been properly held all day. It touched their faces in a way that was almost gentle. Pruitt's wife, Young, recently arrived from Stockton, inhaled sharply, involuntarily. Agnes stood in the doorway with her sleeves rolled to the wrist, cheeks flushed from the close warmth of the small room. Rex rose from the blanket behind her. The thermometer on the bulkhead face behind Agnes read 59 degrees. Harriet looked at her. Agnes looked back with the unhurried expression of someone interrupted mid-thought, not mid-crisis. Harriet had come prepared to be persuasive. The warm air coming through the door had rearranged her arguments without giving her better ones. Agnes. The name carried considerably more weight than its 2 syllables. Come down before the heavy snow settles in. If that car gets buried, we won't be able to dig you out quickly enough. Agnes's expression didn't change. I'll be fine. The flatness of it, not dismissive. Just certain, the way a person is certain of a thing they have tested, made Harriet's prepared responses feel poorly fitted for the actual conversation happening. She tried a different angle. You can't know what this winter will bring. Agnes stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior. Harriet stepped through. She looked at the small stove, its door closed, no roar of combustion, just a faint ticking of hot iron. She looked at the edge of stone visible beneath the raised bed platform. She touched the canvas on the side wall and found it dry. She looked at the thermometer again. How, Harriet asked, and the question was more honest than anything she'd planned to say. Agnes knelt and drew one of the river stones partly from beneath the platform. Heavy things don't let go of warmth quickly. She pressed the stone back into position. The stove gives it. The stone holds it. The walls slow it from leaving. She stood. The fire doesn't need to be large if the room is built to keep what the fire makes. They left the stew. Walking back down, Harriet paused once near the bottom of the slope and looked back through the pines at the railcar gray iron against darker granite smoke from the pipe rising straight up into still air, thin and steady. She stood there long enough for the cold to begin working at the back of her neck through her coat collar. She couldn't find the word for what she had just felt in that room. It wasn't quite heat. It was closer to the sensation of something being handled correctly. She kept walking. The stage from Truckee arrived on a Saturday evening near the end of November carrying 4 men contracted for winter work. Agnes was at the outdoor fire heating the day's stones when she heard the stage on the pass road below the driver's voice, then Walt Corbett's carrying up from the lower camp, then the specific sounds of men unloading in cold air, which have a particular rhythm of efficiency and complaint, then footsteps on the frozen ground below the ridge, a specific pattern she had not heard in 3 years and recognized instantly. She did not look down the slope. She rotated the stones in the fire with the long-handled tongs, checking each face for even heating moving cooler surfaces toward the coals. Edmund Merritt was Thomas's younger brother by 13 years. He was 35, wide through the shoulders, carrying Thomas's coloring without Thomas's temperament. She had not seen him since the funeral, not for lack of proximity in the early months afterward, but because Edmund had made clear through channels and through one direct conversation of no more than 90 seconds that he held Agnes responsible for something he could not fully articulate without his voice changing in a way that seemed to embarrass him. He had contracted for winter work at the camp without knowing she was here. That much was obvious from the way Walt Corbett said her name during the introduction below, and from the specific quality of silence that followed on Edmund's end, the particular stillness of a body registering something it wasn't prepared for. Agnes felt the silence from the ridge the way you feel a change in air pressure, not through any single sense, but through all of them, simultaneously going slightly more alert. He came up to her fire 20 minutes later. He stood 10 feet back from the coals, not advancing. He looked at the rail car, at the smoke from the pipe, at the stones Agnes was working in the fire. He looked at Rex, who had risen from his position at the fire's edge, and stood assessing him with the attentive neutrality of a dog, deciding whether something represented a problem. Edmund did not look at Agnes directly. "You know this is his grade." "I know. You came here on purpose." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. A coal shifted in the fire and sent sparks upward. He watched them die. When he finally spoke again, the words carried the density of something that had been compressed for a long time in a closed space. "He wouldn't have been out there that morning if things were different between you two." Agnes set the tongs down. She looked at Edmund fully for the first time since he'd arrived. He was looking at the rail car, jaw set, hands open at his sides, carrying the posture of a man whose anger had become so foundational to his structure that removing it would require rebuilding from the frame out. She understood what things were different meant. She had been asking Thomas in the months before his death to consider a different position, something that kept him off active grades, something safer, something with less exposure to the specific risks that the Sierra Pass grades carried. She had not been wrong to ask. In 3 years of turning it over from every available angle, she had not found the version of the argument in which asking was wrong. She also knew the last conversation she'd had with Thomas before he left that Tuesday morning had been about exactly that, and it had not ended well, and Thomas had walked out with it unfinished, and she had let him go. She picked the tongs back up. "I know what you believe, Edmund." His jaw worked slightly. "He was the only family I had left." "I know that too." He turned and walked back down the slope without saying anything further. Walt Corbett, who had observed the encounter from the lower camp's edge without appearing to, went inside his cabin and told no one what he'd seen. Agnes transferred the heated stones under the bed platform, checked the system's several components in their sequence, then sat on the edge of the bed and let Rex push his broad head into her lap. She thought about Edmund's face, not the anger in it which she had anticipated, but the exhaustion underneath it. 3 years of directing grief outward at a target, because grief without a direction is simply grief, which is the harder thing to carry. She understood the impulse. She had attempted it herself in the early months. It hadn't held. The physics of what had happened offered no satisfying ledge on which to fix blame. Thomas had gone out, because Thomas always went out when something needed checking. That was the complete story. Everything else was addition. The mountain made its nighttime sounds outside the inner room, the distant percussion of rock contracting in the cold, something moving through the lower pines. Rex shifted once against her leg, resettled. Agnes reached into the trunk at the foot of the bed and took out Thomas's journal. The leather spine was cracked from years of use. She opened it to the last page with writing on it. She had read this page many times in many different rooms, in different light, in different seasons. She read it again now by tallow candle in the small warm room she had built inside the dead rail car on the grade Thomas had surveyed, named, worked on, and never come back from. She read it slowly without rushing the last line. She closed the journal, held it for a moment against her sternum, the cracked spine under her fingertips, the weight of it familiar in the specific way that familiar weight becomes indistinguishable from the weight of the person who used to hold the same object. Rex's ear turned towards something outside wind, probably beginning to move through the pass from the northwest, the first edge of something larger that had been building in the atmosphere for 2 days without anyone in the camp below understanding what they were seeing in the sky. Agnes reached down and placed her hand flat on the nearest river stone at the bed platform's edge. The warmth moved through her palms, steady, patient, the long release of heat that stone performs for hours after the fire that charged it has gone cold. "All right," she said. Not to Rex, not entirely, though his head lifted briefly at the sound of her voice. The word was directed at something that had been waiting for it at a chapter that needed a first sentence before the next one could begin. She blew out the candle. Outside the railcar, the ravens had not called since mid-afternoon. The elk that grazed the lower meadow had moved downslope 2 days earlier, following instincts that read atmospheric pressure before any instrument does. The sky above Sierra Pass at the last light before full dark had turned a deep pressed violet, the color of a bruise, forming slowly spreading east across the peaks from the west, with the patience of something that does not experience urgency because it does not need to. The temperature at the ridge had fallen 16 degrees between sunset and 9 in the evening. The wind from the northwest, which had blown steadily all day, stopped at 9:15. Silence arrived on the ridge the way it always arrives before a serious Sierra storm. Not gradually, not as an absence, but as a presence, a physical weight against the eardrums. Rex raised his head in the dark. His ears moved forward, his breathing slow and even until that moment paused for 3 full seconds. Agnes, on the edge of sleep, felt the silence settle onto the railcar, the way a hand settles onto a shoulder, deliberate, carrying the weight of something about to be said. She lay still. She listened to the quality of the quiet, parsing it, the way Thomas had taught her to parse the sounds of a structure under stress. Not for what is audible, but for what has just stopped being audible. The birds were gone. The wind was gone. The mountain had gone entirely still. Everything had stopped. She pulled the top blanket closer, turned onto her side, placed her left hand flat against the nearest river stone, still warm, still working its slow release, still holding what the afternoon had given it long after the afternoon itself was gone. The first flake of snow fell somewhere above the pass at 9:20. She didn't see it. Below the ridge in the lower camp, no one yet understood what the stopped wind meant, what the color of the western sky at sunset had been saying, what the elk had known 2 days ago. By morning, they would understand. By morning, the world would have rearranged itself into something white, enormous, absolute. The kind of thing that does not ask permission, does not announce itself in language, anyone can hear in time, does not stop because someone below it has not yet made adequate preparations. Agnes Merritt slept. Rex did not. The storm did not announce itself with wind. That was the detail no one in the lower camp had accounted for, the assumption built from prior Sierra winters that a storm of consequence would arrive with sufficient noise to serve as its own warning. Wind first, then snow, then the hard reckoning of how much wood was actually left and how long it would need to last. That was the sequence they understood. They had organized their preparations around that sequence. What came instead was silence, then snow out of silence. Then within 40 minutes of the first flake, the world had reorganized itself so completely that the sequence they'd planned for became irrelevant. By midnight, the snow was falling at a rate that erased footprints within the minute it took to make them. By 2 in the morning, the lower camp's shortest cabin had lost its eaves to accumulation. By 4, the drifts against the north-facing walls had climbed past window height, and the windows themselves, the ones that had any glass left, had gone white on their outer surfaces the way eyes go white in a bad fever. Up on the ridge, the railcar vanished, not gradually, 1 hour it was visible from the pass road as an angular interruption against the slope, its rust-colored iron distinguishable from the granite, even in poor light. The next hour it was simply not there. The snow built against its sides with a speed that seemed personal, precise, targeted as though the storm understood the specific geometry of the car's surface and was fitting itself to it the way water fits a vessel. The drifts climbed the iron flanks. They crossed the roof. By 3 in the morning, there was no line on the ridge that indicated where the railcar ended and the mountain began. It had been absorbed. Inside the outer shell, the iron groaned. The sound was structural, not a crack, not a failure, but the complaint of metal contracting at a rate it hadn't experienced since the previous winter's worst week. The temperature inside the outer chamber of the railcar had dropped to within 12 degrees of the air outside, which meant the iron walls were approaching the temperature of the snow pressing against them from the exterior. The frost that formed on the inner surface of those walls was not frost in the usual sense. It was the visible evidence of thermal transfer, completing itself cold, reaching through iron, finding the slightly warmer air inside the outer shell, extracting its moisture, depositing it in white crystalline patterns along the ribs of the car, like something trying to make the inside of the railcar resemble the outside of a mountain. The inner door held. Agnes was awake by the time the storm reached its first full intensity, not from any single sound, but from the specific combination of pressures her body registered as requiring consciousness. The iron of the outer shell speaking under load. Rex's weight shifting on the boards beside her. The baffle in the upper vent moving slightly under changed air pressure from outside a half-inch of movement, but it altered the airflow pattern across the ceiling of the inner room in a way her sleeping self had cataloged as new information demanding review. She lit the tallow candle, checked the thermometer on the bulkhead face. 59 degrees. She pressed her hand flat to the wool surface of the inner wall. Dry. She put her palm near the pipe running horizontal along the room's edge and felt the steady warmth working outward from the metal. She pulled the corner of her blanket back and reached down to the nearest river stone beneath the platform edge. Still releasing, still warm, not the sharp warmth of a recently charged stone, but the deep, patient warmth of a thing that had stored more than it had yet surrendered. She added one piece of oak the length of her forearm to the stove. Not because the room required it yet, but because the storm outside was large enough that this was a management decision rather than a reactive one. She was feeding the system ahead of the curve, not scrambling to catch up from behind. Thomas had written about this distinction specifically in the journal, in a context unrelated to winter survival, but with the same underlying logic. The difference between a system tended and a system recovered is timing, always timing, and the time to act is before the deficit becomes visible. The outer shell received another impact from the wind, not wind exactly, but the pressure wave that preceded a major gust, the atmospheric equivalent of a door opening suddenly in a closed room. The iron shrieked on the pitch of a blade drawn flat across stone. Rex lifted his head, tracked the sound through the walls, lowered it again when the shriek ended. His assessment was that the source of the sound was not inside the room, which was the relevant criterion. Agnes did not pace, she went back to sleep. Dawn brought no light she could identify through the iron walls, only a gradual shift in the quality of the sound from outside the wind, altering its pitch as the snowpack around the car increased in mass, changing the acoustics of the drift, the way a valley changes the echo of a sound. Once enough snow covers its floor. She took her breakfast, cold dried beans from the bag water from the tin cup, because cooking required fire she hadn't planned into the day's fuel budget. She ate methodically. Rex ate from his portion without ceremony. Below the ridge, the camp had begun what would become its defining activity for the next 6 days, burning things. Walt Corbett's crew had laid in what they'd calculated as a sufficient wood supply in November, 2 cords per cabin, stacked under oilcloth on the eastern side of the camp, where the granite blocked the worst of the northwest wind. What they had not accounted for was a storm that required not the managed steady burning of a normal Sierra winter night, but the sustained aggressive combustion required to hold a cabin interior above freezing when the exterior temperature was dropping toward figures that belonged to a different category of winter entirely. By the second hour of the storm's full intensity, every cabin in camp had a fire that would have been considered excessive under any ordinary circumstance. Logs the diameter of a man's thigh were going into iron stoves designed for wood half that size. The chimneys were working at capacity, throwing heat up and out into a sky that consumed it without acknowledgement, an exchange so asymmetric it barely deserved the word exchange. Wood and warmth briefly, then nothing. The storm did not accumulate warmth from the fires below it. It had no interest in the transaction. Walt stood at his cabin window at mid-morning. The glass fogged the outer surface, now completely snow-covered the world beyond it, reduced to a faint pale glow that told him it was day without telling him anything else, and did the arithmetic he had been avoiding since dawn. He was a man who understood arithmetic clearly enough that he delayed doing it when he suspected the result. The result was that at the current rate of burning, the camp's wood supply would last 4 more days. He left the window without telling anyone the number. Pruitt came in from the woodpile at noon with frost crusted solid in his beard from the 8 minutes it had taken him to haul 2 armloads back through the drift between the stack and the cabin door. His left boot had developed a split at the outer sole that was admitting cold at a rate he could track by the progressive numbness in his little toe. He stood close to the stove and said nothing about the boot, because saying it would require addressing it, which would require going back outside. Edmund Merritt sat in the corner of the cabin that Walt and Pruitt shared, sharpening a knife he had already sharpened that morning. The blade was past needing attention. His hands needed something to do. He had looked toward the ridge when the storm began the night before, had stood outside the cabin for approximately 90 seconds in the first hard snowfall. Watching the ridge disappear, then come inside, sat in this corner, begun the first of what had become a series of maintenance tasks, performed with the focus of a man trying to keep a specific thought from completing itself. No one spoke to him about it. Walt, who understood a great many things about men in closed spaces under pressure, understood that Edmund Merritt was conducting a private argument, that the argument's resolution was not anyone else's to force, and that the most useful thing the camp could offer him was the courtesy of not watching too closely. The second day's particular event arrived at just past mid-morning. Agnes heard it before she understood it, a different vibration from the usual chorus of wind and snow weighed against the outer shell. Something lower in frequency, more irregular, coming not from above or outside, but from beneath the floor of the car. She sat up from where she'd been lying on the platform listening. It was rhythmic, slow, alive. She pressed her ear to the platform boards. The vibration clarified the movement of large bodies directly beneath the iron floor, their breath rising in clouds that would be invisible under the car's belly, their collective mass adding insulation to the underside of the iron in a band 3 feet wide along the car's full length. A small herd of elk, 6'8", possibly more, had moved into the protected space beneath the spur's elevated track section, using the car's belly as a ceiling against the snow. It wouldn't raise the room temperature in any measurable way, but it would slow the rate at which cold transferred upward through the iron floor, which was the surface she had addressed least thoroughly in her preparation. She pressed her hand flat to the floorboards and held it there. The boards were cold, but not as cold as she'd expected after 18 hours of storm. She recorded this in the journal she'd brought up from the trunk. Not Thomas's journal, her own, a smaller notebook she'd bought in Sacramento in September, its pages mostly empty until October. She wrote the elk observation in 2 sentences, then wrote the floor temperature reading, then wrote the current thermometer reading. 60 degrees. She closed the notebook, lay back on the platform, let the irregular rhythm of the animals moving beneath the car floor come up through the boards in a frequency too low to be called sound, more like a fact her body was receiving rather than her ears. She slept through the afternoon of the second day, waking at intervals to manage the system, adding fuel at the intervals she'd established, rotating stones from the outer edge toward the center where their heat would concentrate. Nothing had changed in any direction that required alarm. The storm outside pressed and the inner room held, and Rex slept in his position at the platform's foot. The third day broke the pattern. Agnes discovered the crack in the bulkhead's lower left corner at approximately 8 in the morning when she placed her bare foot on the floor to rise and felt cold moving against her ankle from a direction that should not have produced cold. She was off the platform before the sensation fully registered. She crouched at the base of the bulkhead's left edge, with the candle low shielding its flame with her body. The crack ran 4 inches along the junction between the left tie face and the floor hairline thin, produced by the wood contracting in sustained cold at a rate that outpaced the compression of the wool insulation packed inside the wall. The outer face of the bulkhead, exposed to the frozen outer chamber, had contracted slightly faster than the inner face held at a warmer temperature. The differential had opened a gap that was invisible to casual inspection, but large enough to admit a thread of air that was currently negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit. She stood up, crossed to the supply shelf she'd built from scrapboard above the bed, took down the flour bag, the tin of tallow fat she'd rendered in October for candles, the small pouch of ash she kept from the stove. She worked the three ingredients together with her fingers in the tin cup until she had a paste of roughly the right consistency, not too dry to adhere, not wet enough to shrink dramatically as it cured. She worked it into the crack with the flat end of the knife handle, pressing steadily, forcing the paste as deep into the gap as it would go before adding the next application. She was 2/3 through the repair when the candle went out. Not from wind, the inner room was sealed against drafts at that level. The candle had simply burned to its base while she'd been focused on the crack, a management failure of the smallest kind, but in a room that was now entirely dark except for the faint orange line visible at the stove door's edge. The smallest failure occupied a very large space. She remained crouched. She did not reach for the matches immediately. She set her hands flat on the floor in front of the bulkhead's base, found her position by contact with the surfaces. She knew verified where the crack was by running her fingertips along the base joint until she felt the slight give of uncured paste. She picked up the knife by its handle where she'd left it. She finished the repair by feel pressing, smoothing, checking with the pad of her index finger for gaps, adding paste where the coverage felt thin, checking again. Rex made no sound throughout this. He sat somewhere to her right, breathing in the dark, his presence registered by breath rather than sight. She reached toward the sound of him when the repair was finished, and her hand found his shoulder exactly the way hands find familiar things in darkness, because the body has been navigating by memory long before the eyes admitted they needed help. She lit a new candle from the match tin, held it near the repaired crack for 30 seconds. The flame held steady. She sat back on the platform, hands still carrying the tacky residue of the paste, and let the particular exhaustion of sustained precision, work in inadequate conditions, move through her. Not fear, the fear window had been open and closed in roughly 45 seconds. What remained was a bone-deep awareness of how many small things she had gotten right and how a single small thing going wrong in the wrong sequence could unravel what the right things had built. She did not let herself stay in that awareness longer than necessary. She washed her hands with the cloth she kept dampened against the warmth near the stove, checked the thermometer 57 degrees down, 3 from the prior, reading the crack's work before she'd found it, added fuel, rotated the stones towards center, recorded the numbers. Small corrections, nothing more. The fourth day brought what Agnes had expected since the storm began, even if she hadn't named the expectation. The sound reached her through the outer shell in a register below. What the wind occupied a sharp, flat report, structural in nature, followed by voices at a pitch and pace that people reach only when the situation has moved faster than their preparation. Walt's cabin roof had given way on its north-facing section. The snow load accumulating across the lower camp structures had been working on that particular span of roofing for 36 hours. The nails were old, the wood had been aging for 11 years. The angle of the pitch was shallow enough that the snow didn't slide, but accumulated and stayed patient, adding mass with every hour of snowfall until the structural capacity of the lumber was simply exceeded and the span let go. Not catastrophically, not a collapse that swallowed the room. One section of the north face, roughly 4 feet by 8, folded inward under the weight of snow it had been supporting, admitting a cascade of packed snow into the cabin's northeast corner. No one was standing there. That was the whole of the good news. The bad news organized itself quickly and practically. 15 men now needed to be distributed among 2 remaining structurally sound cabins designed for 8 each. The combined wood supply for those cabins, already running lower than Walt's pre-storm calculation had suggested as viable, would now be consumed at a rate reflecting 30 bodies worth of heat demand rather than 15. Walt stood outside in waist-deep snow with a lantern held overhead, looking at the collapsed section, while the wind worked at the lantern's flame through the glass. The arithmetic he did in his head this time was faster than the morning's calculation because it required no rounding. He looked toward the ridge. There was nothing to look at, only white. The ridge itself indistinguishable from the sky above it. But he looked anyway, the way people look in the direction of something they've been trying not to think about. Edmund Merritt had helped pull 2 men from the debris of the collapsed section before the situation fully registered. He moved with the specific efficiency of someone whose body has decided to act before the mind has finished its arguments, which is how most useful action gets done in emergencies. When the men were out, when the situation was contained, when Walt had organized the redistribution of the remaining wood supply, with the joyless competence of someone who has had to organize insufficient resources Before Edmund returned to the interior of the surviving cabin, found the corner furthest from the company, sat down. The knife was in his coat pocket. He did not take it out. He sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor in the specific posture of a man doing internal work that doesn't show on the surface. The floor was pine cold enough that the chill came up through the soles of his boots, while he sat a slow, certain communication that he registered without responding to. He was looking at the direction of the ridge again, without meaning to the way a compass needle moves, without the compass deciding to move. Harriet Cole in the second cabin organized the women and younger men into an arrangement that maximized shared body heat without requiring anyone to acknowledge that was what they were doing. She was good at this, at making necessity look like preference, at organizing people into the configuration the situation required while allowing them to believe they'd arrived there by their own inclination. She had been doing this her entire adult life in various forms. She had never expected it to be her primary survival skill, but here she was. She looked at the thermometer nailed to the cabin wall near the window. 38 degrees inside. The stove was working at full capacity. Outside, the storm continued its patient insistence. Agnes, on the ridge above all of this, knew none of the specifics. She knew in the abstract the general direction events were likely moving in the lower camp. She had understood the structural vulnerabilities of those cabins. From her first full look at the camp in October, had noted the shallow pitch of Walt's roofline. With the eye of someone who had spent years living in structures Thomas assessed and discussed at the kitchen table, bringing the day's observations home in the form of evaluation. She had said nothing in October because it wasn't her camp, her cabin, her call. She opened the inner door 2 inches for 3 seconds and closed it again, reading the outer chamber temperature by the rate at which her exhaled breath condensed in the gap. Roughly 10 above zero. She noted this against the prior day's check. The outer shell was growing colder as the storm deepened, which meant the snowpack surrounding the car was simultaneously a growing liability at the sealed door and an increasing asset at every other surface. A natural insulating layer building itself around the car's sides and roof, slowing the rate at which cold transferred through iron that was no longer exposed to moving air. Snow was both the threat and the answer. This had been true since the beginning. She had simply tried to make sure the answer arrived in the right places. The 5th day was the quiet one. Outside the railcar, the storm hadn't abated. If anything, the snowfall had intensified during the night into the dense, heavy accumulation that follows the first wave of a major Sierra system. The secondary band that arrives after the leading edge has exhausted the atmosphere's initial fury and replaced it with something slower, more committed, less dramatic, but ultimately more consequential. The sound against the outer shell had shifted from the shrieking percussion of high wind to a muffled, steady pressure, the sound of enormous weight arriving without urgency. Agnes found the unread journal page by accident. She had been reaching past Thomas's journal for the notebook on the supply shelf when her thumb caught the journal's cover, and it fell from the shelf open to the platform. She picked it up by its spine, intending to close it. The page it had fallen to was not a page she recognized. It was near the back of the journal, past the last entry she had ever read, past the final date she associated with Thomas's writing, past what she had understood to be the book's last words in his hand. But there were 2 more pages. The handwriting was smaller than his usual, compressed, as though the thoughts had arrived faster than his standard pace allowed, or as though he had understood he was writing in a space that had a specific limit. She sat down on the platform without meaning to. The entry was undated, which was unusual for Thomas, who dated everything: invoices, letters, grocery lists, the preliminary sketches he made of every grade before he committed to formal drawings. An undated entry meant it had been written outside his normal working rhythm, probably quickly, probably without the deliberate intention that characterized his professional notebooks. He had written about heat, specifically about the way Agnes maintained warmth in the drafty farmhouses where they had lived through the first years of their marriage before his contracts became large enough to support better housing. He had written that she had understood intuitively and without training several principles he'd spent years studying formally in the context of building structures, that a small, well-sealed space retains heat more efficiently than a large, poorly sealed one. That thermal mass is more reliable over a long, cold period than active flame. That the goal of a heated space is not to generate warmth, but to prevent warmth from escaping. He had written, Agnes understands heat the way I understand load-bearing calculation, not as a theory but as a physical fact, with consequences she's been navigating her whole life. The line below that read, if I ever build the mountain station I've been sketching, I'll use everything she's taught me without knowing she was teaching. The last line on the page, the final writing in the journal read, "She was never wrong about any of it." Agnes sat with the journal open on her knees for a long time. The thermometer read 56 degrees, the lowest reading since the storm began, the crack's residual effect combined with the fifth day's temperature drop, pushing the system toward its lower margin. She should have registered this as the primary situation requiring attention. She would in a moment. She sat with the journal open until the moment was ready to end itself, which required slightly longer than she had expected. When she finally moved, her eyes were dry, but her hands were not quite steady. She set the journal on the platform beside her, open to the last page. She rose, crossed to the stove, added fuel, not one piece but two, the first time since the storm's beginning that she'd varied the fuel amount upward rather than holding the line. She rotated the stones, bringing the warmest surfaces towards center position. She added the wool vest that had been Thomas's, the one that had been in the trunk since October, to the layer beneath the mattress, tucking it flat against the boards where it would trap the stone heat against the sleeping surface. She worked through the adjustments without urgency, without the reactive scramble that 56 degrees might have provoked from someone managing by instinct rather than by system. Then she sat back down, reached out, placed one hand on the open journal's page, left it there for a moment. Rex had been watching her from his position on the blanket since the journal fell. He watched her now, the specific watching of a dog that understands something is happening that it cannot fix, so instead it remains present, without intruding, which is its own form of competence. The thermometer began its slow climb back toward 58. The sixth day was the silent one. Not the silence of the storm abating. The storm had not abated. The silence of deep burial. The snow around the railcar had compressed, settled, interacted with itself under its own weight, until the mass surrounding the car was no longer loose accumulation, but packed substance, and packed substance does not transmit sound efficiently. The wind that had been audible through the outer shell since the storm's first hour had become something Agnes could feel as faint vibration, rather than hear as distinct percussion. The world outside the railcar had effectively ceased to exist as a sonic event. The inner room's temperature held at 58 degrees through the morning, 57 through the afternoon. The system was working at the lower margin of its design parameters, which was not failure, but it was the edge of the margin. Agnes managed it with the consciousness of someone walking a trail that has adequate width, but has not been walked for so long that its edges are no longer entirely clear. She was recording the afternoon temperature reading in her notebook when the first vibration arrived through the floor. Not from the elk had moved in the night of the fourth day, their weight disappearing from the boards in the pre-dawn hours as they relocated somewhere with a different calculus of shelter. This vibration was different in rhythm, different in origin. It came from the uphill end of the car rather than from beneath the center. It came in pairs. It came with intention. She set the notebook down. The vibration came again. Two impacts close together against the iron skin of the car's upper end, where the snow had pressed hardest. She recognized the rhythm before she had processed it cognitively. The recognition was physical, arriving in her chest before her mind had a name for it. Metal striking metal through packed snow. A shovel hitting the car's roof section where it met the drift. She told herself it could be acoustic distortion. Sound traveled strangely through heavy snowpack. A rock shifting somewhere on the slope above the spur could arrive at the car's iron skin in a pattern that resembled something other than what it was. She sat completely still and listened with the quality of attention that has no room in it for what it wants to hear. The third impact came with a different angle, not the roof, but the upper section of the car's far-end wall, followed immediately by a fourth at the same angle but slightly lower. Someone had found the wall through the snowpack and was working downward along it methodically with an instrument rather than by chance. Then voices, muffled to the point of being textureless. No words, no individual timbre, just the fact of human vocalization behind layers of snow and iron. Plural, more than one person working. Rex stood up, not the defensive posture of a dog encountering a threat, but the alert readiness of one whose context had just changed from waiting to anticipating. His tail moved once low, controlled. The voices came again, slightly louder, the shovel work progressing, reducing the snowpack between the speakers and the outer shell. Agnes heard before she could distinguish any word, a tone shift in the vocal pattern that indicated someone had called something specific, a name shape rather than a work direction. She stood up from the platform. She moved to the inner door without hurrying. She pressed her palm flat to the nearest riverstone at the platform's edge. Warm, still working, still holding what 6 days had tried to take. Then the outer sliding door of the railcar groaned the sound of the metal track working against weeks of cold-set rust and the weight of the snow piled against its exterior base. And voices came through, no longer muffled but present, carrying the specific urgency of people who have been working towards something for long enough that arriving at it feels disorienting. From inside the outer shell, through the iron walls of the car, through the bulkhead, through the canvas, through the wool, through the dark warmth of the inner room, she heard it clearly. Mrs. Merritt, Edmund's voice. She would have known it in a snowstorm at 6,000 feet, buried under 10 feet of packed ice filtered through iron and hardwood, and everything that had accumulated between them over 3 years. She would have known it because it was structurally Thomas's voice, with different weight in it, the same pitch, the same baseline resonance, carrying grief where Thomas had carried certainty, the way a key fits a lock, it was never meant for but shares the relevant geometry. Rex gave one low bark, not alarm, confirmation. Agnes stood at the inner door with her hand on the latch. The cold in the outer chamber was pressing against the other side of the door. She could feel it at the threshold gap, that specific cold that has been building itself against a barrier for 6 days and knows exactly how much energy it has banked. On the other side of that cold, Edmund, Walt. Other voices she couldn't yet separate. She thought briefly a thought that lasted the length of one breath drawn and released about the 3 years of silence between herself and Edmund, about the weight of what he believed about the letter sitting in the bottom of her trunk under Thomas's journal, the one Thomas had written to his brother and left in her keeping with 4 words on the outside, "Send this if needed." She had judged the need for 3 years without acting on it. She lifted the latch. The door swung inward on its leather hinges, which Agnes had kept supple through the 6 days with a weekly application of tallow fat, a detail so small it had never seemed worth noting, until this moment when the door moved without resistance, without the shriek of cold swollen wood fighting its frame opening cleanly into the outer chamber's frozen dark. The cold hit her at the threshold the way cold at -28 hits any warm surface immediately, without negotiation, with the absolute confidence of a force that has been waiting outside a barrier long enough to have lost patience with the concept of barriers. She felt it move across her face, her forearms where her sleeves remained rolled the strip of skin above her collar. She did not step back. She held the door open with one hand flat against its inner surface, letting the cold come to her rather than moving into it. Edmund stood in the outer chamber's dim space 3 feet from her inner door. The light reaching him came from 2 sources. The lantern Walt held to his left, its flame throwing orange against the ice-laced iron ribs of the car's interior. The thin bluish light entering through the outer sliding door behind the group, which they had forced open with iron pry bars after 20 minutes of working the frozen track. That second light, 6 days of indirect winter sky, compressed through a passage cut through 10 feet of packed snow, fell on Edmund's face in a way that made it difficult to read. His beard had accumulated frost from the excavation work. His coat was stiff with it. The skin visible above his collar was the specific pale gray of a man who has been cold long enough that the body has rationalized the cold as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. He was looking at the open door, at the warm air coming through it. Warm air moves visibly when it meets sufficient cold, not as steam, not as fog, but as a slight shimmer, a distortion at the boundary where 2 different temperatures negotiate their difference. This shimmer existed at Agnes's door in the moment she opened it, a thin, wavering line at the threshold that marked the edge of what she had built. Edmund was looking at it with an expression that had not finished forming yet. Walt stood 2 steps behind Edmund's left shoulder. Pruitt flanked the opposite side jaw, set against the cold boots ringing against frozen iron when he shifted his weight. 2 younger men Agnes recognized from the pre-storm camp occupied the space behind them, their breath making rapid clouds in the outer chamber air. All of them were looking at the open door, at the shimmer, at the thermometer visible on the bulkhead face behind Agnes, its mercury column reading 57 degrees. None of them spoke immediately. People often go quiet when what they're seeing requires them to revise a belief they've been operating on for some time, because revision of that kind takes a moment of internal silence to complete. Agnes stepped aside from the doorway. She gestured once briefly toward the interior. Edmund crossed the threshold first. The warmth closed around him, the way warmth does when you've been cold long enough to have stopped expecting anything different, not as a sensation so much as an alteration in the body's fundamental relationship to the air it occupies. His shoulders dropped 2 inches without him appearing to notice. The lines across his forehead, which had been set in the rigid pattern of sustained physical effort, softened into something less deliberate. He exhaled a long, slow release of breath that was not quite a sound but carried the weight of one. He looked at the stove in the corner, its door closed, its surface dull orange at the joints, where heat pushed through the iron seams. He looked at the platform bed at the edge of stone visible beneath it, gray river rock, heat charged 6 days ago, still giving, still working its slow release in a way that asked nothing from the fire to continue. He looked at the supply shelf above the bed where Thomas's journal lay open. The handwriting on the visible page was not Agnes's. Edmund had grown up reading that hand, had watched it form itself across report cards, across birthday inscriptions, across the backs of photographs, across a letter he had never read, because receiving it had made the death actual in a way the funeral somehow hadn't. His face changed. Not dramatically, not the collapse of expression that grief performs in private, when there's no audience to perform restraint for. Something smaller, a tightening across the eyes, a slight parting at the lips, the look of a man who has walked into a room expecting one thing and found it occupied by something he had not prepared for. He stared at the open journal for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Agnes with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger, not accusation, not the studied neutrality he deployed when anger was present, but being managed. This was something prior to all of those things. Something that had not yet decided what it would become. Walt crossed the threshold behind him. The warmth hit Walt differently, practically immediately as information his body processed before his mind reached for interpretation. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the barely glowing stove. He looked at the wood supply Agnes had maintained beside it. A stack of short oak pieces, each roughly forearm length, the stack still holding more than half its original height after 6 days of the worst storm in recent Sierra memory. "You burned the whole forest," Pruitt's voice from the doorway, not cynical, genuinely trying to account for the math. Agnes shook her head once. 3 small pieces a day, some days less. She said it the way a person states a measurement, without defensiveness, without pride, as a number the situation had produced rather than a choice she was claiming credit for. Walt crouched at the edge of the platform and reached beneath it with one gloved hand, feeling toward the nearest stone. His hand made contact. He pulled it back, not from pain, but from the involuntary response of someone who expected cold and received its opposite. He stayed crouched, looking at the stones. His glove was off his right hand before he seemed to decide to remove it. He pressed his bare palm flat against the stone surface. He stayed there for several seconds. When he stood, he removed the left glove, as well held both hands near the room's steady warmth, and let his fingers move from stiff to flexible, with the patient incremental surrender of joints that have been locked in cold for days and are only now remembering their original range. He looked at the canvas walls dry. He looked at the ceiling frost-free. He looked at the vent baffle Agnes had cut high in the bulkhead, the wool-covered floor opening below it, the entire system working its quiet circulation without requiring any attention from anyone to continue doing so. How does the air stay clean? The question came from one of the younger men at the doorway, honest curiosity rather than challenge. 6 days in overcrowded, heavily fired cabins had made air quality a matter of immediate personal relevance. Agnes indicated the vent positions, high in the bulkhead, low at the base. Warm air rises and exits. Cooler air enters at the floor. The loop moves without forcing it. She kept the explanation short, direct. The stove consumes less oxygen when it burns small. Small combustion in a well-insulated room holds temperature without fouling the air the way a large fire does in a leaking space. Walt turned to look at her directly. He had the expression of a man finishing an argument he had been conducting with himself for some time and arriving reluctantly at a conclusion he didn't choose. "We burned through 3/4 of the stack," his voice carrying the flatness of a statement made without expectation of sympathy. "2 cabins worth of wood in 4 days. 1 roof came in on the 5th. He paused. 15 men jammed into 2 structures. Water's been freezing in the buckets since day 3. Agnes looked at him steadily. She had known this was coming, not the specific sequence of events, but the general shape of it, the consequence that would eventually climb the ridge and stand in front of her. How many left in camp? 15. Walt's jaw was set, jammed in two structures. Water's been freezing in the buckets since day 3. She looked at the space behind them, the frozen outer chamber, the snow light filtering through the passage cut to the exterior. 3 at a time, she said. 10 minutes each. The air needs to stay balanced. Too many bodies will pull the humidity up, which pulls the temperature down. She looked at Pruitt. Don't touch the canvas walls. Don't crowd the stove. Don't open the outer door while people are inside. Walt looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a man who has spent decades being the person who organizes things, encountering the experience of being organized by someone else. He didn't argue. He turned to the men behind him and distributed the instructions in a tone that indicated he had decided to treat them as his own. They came in shifts, 3 men, 10 minutes departure the next 3. Agnes monitored the thermometer at each interval. The first group brought the temperature down to 54 degrees within 4 minutes of entering 3 bodies releasing heat they'd accumulated nowhere into a space already working to maintain its margin. She fed the stove 1 extra piece at the halfway point, the first deviation from her standard interval in 6 days, calculated rather than reactive, adding input before the system dropped rather than after. Pruitt's boots had a split at the outer sole that had been admitting cold for days. Agnes found this out when he sat on the platform edge to allow the warmth to work on his feet, and she saw the split's gap open when he flexed his foot. She produced the flour ash paste she'd used on the bulkhead crack, applied it to the outer sole's gap with the knife handle in a bead that wouldn't hold indefinitely, but would hold long enough. Pruitt watched this being done to his boot without speaking. When she finished, he looked at the repair for a moment, then looked at her. Then looked at the floor with the particular expression of a young man encountering a form of care he hadn't anticipated. The second group came through and included 2 men from the night crew. Agnes hadn't spoken to since October large. Quiet, the kind of workers who communicate primarily through the quality of their physical presence in a space. They stood in the inner room's warmth with a stillness that was different from the first group's restless adjustment. They stood like animals that have found shelter and have not yet decided whether to trust it. Their color returned to their faces in the 10-minute interval, the gray pale of sustained cold giving way to something closer to normal circulation. One of them on the way out paused at the inner door's threshold and looked back at the room. The small stove, the stones, the canvas walls, the thermometer holding at 56 with an expression that required no translation. Harriet Cole came with the third group. She was bundled in 2 coats, her own layered under a man's overcoat that was too large at the shoulders. Her hands were wrapped in wool strips the way Agnes's had been wrapped during the stone-hauling days in October. She stepped into the inner room's warmth, stopped, closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at Agnes without the social framing she usually deployed, without the coordination of expectations expression, without the management of what she needed versus what the situation would provide. She looked at her the way people look at each other when circumstances have burned away everything that isn't necessary. She sat on the floor. Not the platform. She lowered herself to the wooden floor, crossed her legs, sat with her back against the canvas-covered wall. She wasn't crying exactly. There was moisture at the corners of her eyes, but her expression wasn't grief. It was closer to the involuntary response of a body that has been in sustained crisis long enough that encountering the absence of crisis produces a physical reaction. It needs a moment to process. Agnes sat across from her on the floor. They didn't speak for most of the 10 minutes. Rex crossed the room and lay down between them, which neither woman commented on. When Harriet finally rose to leave, she paused at the inner doorway. After this, a pause in which she found the words carefully. After the snow clears, you should come down. Agnes looked at her. Harriet's expression was different from the one she'd worn when she'd climbed the ridge with the stew back in November, that had been urgency wearing the face of care. This was something with less agenda in it. Not to be looked after, to teach. Agnes held her look for a moment without answering. The word teach sat in the warm air of the small room as something that needed no immediate response, the kind of statement that is already in agreement whether acknowledged or not. The last group included Edmund. He had gone out with the others after his first entrance, spending the interval between rotations working with Walt to brace the tunnel they'd cut through the snowpack, shoring its walls with boards salvaged from the broken outer spurs fencing, so the passage remained open rather than settling back into itself. He came back into the outer chamber with the others, but entered the inner room last after the 2 men he'd come with had taken their positions near the stove. He stood against the bulkhead near the inner door, arms crossed over his chest, not from coldness, but from the posture of a man holding himself in a contained position, because the alternative was to take up more space than he decided he was entitled to. He looked at the journal on the shelf. He had been looking at it since the first entrance. Agnes understood, not continuously, but with the recurring pull of something unresolved, the way your eye returns to an object in a room that your mind hasn't finished with. The two men rotated out at the 10-minute mark. Edmund stayed. Agnes made no move to redirect him. She added fuel to the stove, the interval was due regardless, and checked the room's several needs in their order. Ordinary maintenance performed without haste, without the social performance of appearing to ignore him. She was simply doing what needed doing, which had been the organizing principle of the past 6 days, and which didn't suspend itself because the situation had changed. Edmund uncrossed his arms. He looked at the journal on the shelf with the specific attention of someone who has made a decision. Thomas wrote to me, his voice lower than usual, calibrated to the small room's intimacy rather than to the outer chamber's cold. Before the accident, I received word that a letter existed, but by the time his effects were settled, he stopped, tried a different entry to the same thought. I knew there was a letter. I told the foreman I didn't want it. Agnes set the tongs down on the stove's edge. She turned to look at him fully. I couldn't. Something working in his jaw. I understood it would make certain things final that I needed to keep unfinished. He glanced at the journal again. Is that his yes? You've been carrying it since. Since the land office, August. Edmund absorbed this. He was processing the timeline, the 4 months between August and November. The deliberateness of her coming here, the specific choice of this rail car, the journal carried up this slope in October, alongside the wool blankets and the tin stove and the folding ruler. He was fitting the pieces together into a shape that was different from the shape he'd been carrying for 3 years, and the difference was significant enough that he needed to hold still while it happened. Agnes crossed to the trunk at the platform's foot. She had known since October that she would reach this point, had known it in the way you know something you haven't let yourself know directly, the knowledge existing in the peripheral vision of your understanding rather than at its center. She lifted the journal, reached beneath it. The envelope was there, Thomas's handwriting on its face. Edmund's name in the careful block letters Thomas used for correspondence, he considered important. Below Edmund's name in smaller writing, Agnes, send this if needed. The envelope was sealed. It had been sealed since Thomas wrote it, left on the kitchen table the morning he went out, placed in her keeping, with the quiet certainty of a man who understood risk without dramatizing it. She had carried it for 3 years without making the decision not to send it, which was its own kind of decision. She held it out to Edmund. He looked at it for a moment before taking it. His hand was steadier than she expected, which meant he had been preparing himself for this longer than the conversation suggested, had perhaps been preparing since he saw Thomas's handwriting in the journal, or since he'd first heard her name at the camp's edge in November, or possibly since before that in some private way he hadn't articulated. He took the envelope. Agnes moved to the far end of the small room and gave him what privacy 8 feet could accommodate. She checked the thermometer, 57 degrees, straightened the supply shelf, pressed the wall canvas at 2 points to confirm its dryness. Behind her, she heard the paper open, a small, precise sound in the close warmth of the inner room. Brief, the sound of something sealed for years meeting the moment of its opening. The silence that followed the paper's opening lasted longer than she had expected. She did not turn around. Rex, from his position on the blanket, watched Edmund with the attentive stillness he reserved for moments he understood to be important, without understanding their specific content. When Edmund finally moved, it was to sit on the platform edge. He sat with the letter in both hands, looking at it with his elbows on his knees. The quality of the posture was different from the one she'd seen through the cabin window 6 days ago. That earlier posture had been the containment of something trying to remain directed outward. This one was the posture of something that had lost its direction and was discovering what it felt like to simply sit with itself. Thomas had written. Agnes knew this only because of what Edmund's face did as he read, not from any direct knowledge of the letter's contents, something that reorganized the geometry of the story Edmund had been telling himself for 3 years. She watched this reorganization occur in real time, the slight incremental softening of the set around his eyes, the long exhale partway through the point near the letter's end, where his head dropped slightly and he held the position for 3 seconds before raising it again. He folded the letter, held it against his knee, looked at the stove. He went out because of a survey stake. Edmund's voice had changed timbre quieter, carrying the texture of something that had just set down a weight it had been holding so long it had forgotten the weight wasn't part of its natural structure. He saw movement in the stakes from the camp road the evening before. He wrote that he planned to check it in the morning. A pause in which the stove clicked and the room held its warmth between them. He said you'd tried to get him to wait, to send someone else. Agnes said nothing. This was not the moment for her to speak. She understood this with a clarity that required no deliberation. He said you were right. Edmund's voice didn't break. It arrived at a different register the way a road arrives at a river crossing. Not a failure of the road, but a place where the road has to become something else to continue. That he knew you were right when he left. That he went anyway because he was. The next word required a breath to carry it. Because he was always going to go check it. Because that was what he was. The truth of this sat in the room between them, occupying the space that argument had previously occupied. It didn't require Agnes to respond to. It was simply true the way temperature is true, the way the thermometer's reading is true, not a position someone advocates for, but a fact the situation has produced. A long silence. Rex's breathing, slow and even, was the only sound the room offered. Edmund looked at the journal on the supply shelf at Thomas's handwriting the last pages. Then he looked at Agnes with an expression that had finished forming not absolution, not the dramatic release of a burden in a single gesture, but something quieter. The look of a man who has been arguing with the wrong version of a story for long enough that stopping the argument feels like losing something even when the argument was wrong. He was learning what it felt like to stop. He knew what you were doing, Edmund said finally. His chin indicated the room around them, the canvas walls, the stones, the stove. In the letter, he wrote that he'd watched you manage the cold in every house you ever lived in without once having to be told the principle behind what you were doing. Something crossed his face that was the closest it had come to a smile since she'd first heard his footstep in the lower camp. He said you were the better engineer. Agnes looked at the journal on the shelf. She thought of the last line on the last page, the line she had read countless times by now, in the years since it was written in every room she had occupied since Thomas's death, in the way that certain sentences become structural elements of a person's architecture rather than merely words they remember. She was never wrong about any of it. Edmund stood. He picked up the letter, folded it with care into his coat's interior pocket close to the chest, the way you carry something that has become too important to keep at a distance. He crossed to the inner doorway. He put his right hand flat against the doorframe of the bulkhead, the dense hardwood of the inner face warm under his palm from the heat it had been holding since October. He held his hand there for 3 seconds. Then he stepped through into the outer chamber's cold, without looking back, his footsteps crossing the frozen iron floor toward the light of the snow passage. Agnes stood at the inner doorway and listened to his retreating steps until the outer sliding door groaned shut behind him. The cold pressed back from the outer chamber, and she let it settle at the threshold without retreating from it. In the lower camp, the process of accounting was underway. Walt had sent Pruitt out at first light to assess the structural damage, which cabins could be salvaged, which required rebuilding from the foundation, what the snow removal would demand in organized labor over the coming days. Pruitt came back with the report Walt had expected 2 cabins requiring significant reconstruction before they'd hold occupancy safely through the remainder of winter. The remaining wood supply, stretched to maximum across the camp, would last perhaps 3 more weeks at the consumption rate the storm had forced. 3 weeks was enough time to restock from the lower valley provided the pass road cleared within the week. Walt organized the work parties with the efficiency of a man for whom organization is a form of comfort in situations that have produced too little of it. He assigned teams to the tunnel network, to the wood assessment, to the structural repair crews. He did this standing in the open air of the camp for the first time in 6 days, the cold working at his face in air that was still and bright and no longer malicious, just cold, which was a distinction he had not fully appreciated before this particular morning. Edmund worked with the tunnel crew through the morning. He worked with the specific application of someone who has resolved an internal argument and can now apply full attention to external things. He did not speak much, which was consistent with his general approach, but the quality of his silence had changed. The difference between a man carrying something heavy he refuses to acknowledge and a man who has simply put the thing down is visible in the body's relationship to space and movement. Edmund moved differently by mid-morning. The men working beside him registered this without identifying it. Agnes descended the ridge in the early afternoon. She came down through the snow passage the men had cut and expanded through the morning. Rex moving ahead through the tunnel's width, emerging at the spur's lower end onto the packed surface of the camp's upper edge. The air was crystalline, the specific optical quality Sierra Nevada carries after a major storm, when the atmosphere has been scoured clean by days of sustained weather and everything the eye lands on has an edge sharper than usual. She stood at the top of the camp's main path for a moment, looking at the damage in full daylight. Walt saw her from his reconstruction crew's position at what remained of his former cabin's north wall. He crossed to her with the directness of a man who has decided that the conversation ahead of him is one he'd rather initiate than receive. The method, he said without preamble. The phrase landed deliberately, not sarcastically, not admiringly in the uncomplicated way admiration usually arrives, but with the specific weight of a man extending credit for something that cost him something to extend. If we rebuild those two structures in the spring, if we build them the way you built your room, what would we need that we don't have? Agnes looked at the damaged cabins. She considered the materials available, the tools, the labor the camp's crew could provide. She thought about the principles, not the improvised salvage version she had built in a railcar on a dead spur with whatever the mountain offered, but the clean version built with intention from the start, with proper lumber, properly fitted seams, proper thermal mass laid in rather than heated from outside the structure. River stone for the floors, she said. Dense hardwood for the interior shell. The exterior walls need two skins with a sealed cavity between not just doubled lumber, but a true dead air gap maintained with wooden spacers at regular intervals. She paused. The venting design matters most. You can build the best insulated room on the Sierra and suffocate yourself in it if the air doesn't move correctly. Walt nodded once. The nod had more in it than simple agreement. It carried the quality of a conclusion reached through evidence rather than preference. He was not a man who changed positions often. When he did, he changed them completely. Call it the merit method, he said. Not a question. Agnes held his look for a moment. Not mine alone. She said it without drama as a correction of attribution, not to establish claim, but because precision mattered. Thomas worked out the principles. I applied them. A pause in which she considered whether to add the next part. She added it, but I applied them. So merit method. Walt accepted this without comment. He was Agnes had come to understand over the months since October, a man who respected precision of attribution above most other qualities. Harriet organized this camp's midday meal with the same efficiency she'd applied to everything since the storm began, a larger production than usual, pulling the communal stores in a way that acknowledged the 6 days without dwelling on them. The meal serving the function of a collective exhale. People ate with the particular appetite of those who have been managing resources carefully for long enough that stopping the management feels briefly irrationally like permission. Edmund sat at the far end of the communal table. He ate without the inward-facing isolation that had characterized his corner of the cabin through the storm. When Pruitt spoke to him about the afternoon's tunnel work, Edmund answered directly, practically, with the collaborative attention of someone present in the conversation rather than adjacent to it. When Walt passed behind him and set a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture so quick it might have been accidental, Edmund didn't stiffen. He simply continued eating. Agnes sat beside Harriet. They talked about the spring construction plans in the practical terms of people who have decided that a thing will be done and are working out the how. Harriet had ideas about interior layout that Agnes found structurally sound. Agnes had concerns about Harriet's preferred ceiling height. Too generous, she said, too much volume for the thermal mass to sustain efficiently through a long cold period. They negotiated. They arrived at a number neither had begun with. Both considered the result better than their individual starting positions. Edmund did not approach Agnes during the meal or during the afternoon's work. She did not approach him. This was not distance, it was the particular space that exists between people who have said the necessary things, which requires time to become ordinary ground before anything further can be built on it. The acknowledgement that ordinary ground was now possible was itself a kind of foundation. The sun dropped behind the western ridge at 3:45 shorter days, being Sierra December's most inflexible characteristic. The temperature fell 40 degrees in the 90 minutes after sunset, with the brisk efficiency of a high-altitude environment that has no thermal mass of its own to release into the night air. Agnes made her way back up to the ridge before the light was fully gone. Rex preceding her through the packed snow, his breath making small horizontal plumes in the cold air. She checked the outer chamber as she passed through the ice on the interior. Ribs had thickened during the day, the outer shell running colder now that the excavated passage had restored airflow around the car's exterior. A structural note she recorded in her notebook once inside snow burial, paradoxically, had provided a degree of insulation that its removal had partially eliminated. She would account for this in the spring design recommendations building in the wall cavity what the snow had provided by accident. The inner room held 56 degrees. She fed the stove, the evening ration heated 4 replacement stones in the small outdoor fire she built against the sheltered end of the car's exterior, then transferred them beneath the platform, swapping the longest-serving stones toward the outer edge where their diminished output would supplement rather than carry the primary load. She settled the new stones in their positions, confirmed the canvas remained dry at the lower edges, where condensation most often made its early attempts, checked the vent. Everything holding. Everything dry. She sat on the edge of the platform with Thomas's journal in her lap open to the last pages. Rex settled across her feet with his particular weight, the specific density of him, which she had long since stopped noticing consciously, and which she now noticed only in the way you notice the absence of something familiar, not consciously, but in the body's record. She read the last page again, not because she had forgotten it. She read it because there was a difference between knowing a thing and reading a thing, and on this particular evening, the 7th day, the first clear evening with Edmund's voice still carrying its changed timbre in the air of her memory, with the storm past and the damage being tallied, and the first shape of what came next beginning to organize itself in the camp below. The difference between knowing and reading mattered. She was never wrong about any of it. The last line. The final thing Thomas Merritt had written in his professional life in the margins of a notebook about railroad engineering before going out on a Tuesday morning in March to look at a survey stake he was worried about because that was what he was. Agnes sat with the words, not against them, not pressing them for comfort they couldn't fully provide, not performing a relationship to them that would require maintenance. Simply sitting with them the way you sit with someone whose presence has become so foundational that its shape is indistinguishable from the shape of your own. When she finally closed the journal and set it on the platform, the motion was unhurried, the motion of completing something rather than ending it. She reached down without looking to the nearest stone's edge and pressed her palm flat against its surface. Warm, still working, hours of release still available in the dense gray rock that she had carried up this slope 10 at a time in October in the canvas sling Thomas had never seen, using principles Thomas had articulated in a notebook that had outlasted him by 3 years. Heat stored, held, given back slowly. The stone did not conserve its warmth through effort. It conserved it through what it was made of, through density, through structure, through the fundamental physical fact of its composition, which had been the same composition for longer than anything in this conversation had existed, longer than the grief or the accusation or the storm or the rail car or the grade Thomas had surveyed and named. It was still warm because warm was what it had been asked to hold. And dense stone does not let go of what it has been given simply because the source is gone. Outside the rail car in the specific Sierra dark that follows a storm's passage, when the sky has been scoured completely clear, when the stars above the granite are not scattered, but structural, when the cold is absolute, but not malicious. Simply honest. The cold of a high place, doing exactly what a high place does. In December, the smoke from the pipe above the car's roof was barely visible. Too thin to catch the eye of anyone looking up from the pass road below. It was the smoke of a fire doing no more than it needed to do in a room built to need very little. Agnes blew out the candle. In the dark of the inner room, the stove's seam glow made a faint orange line along the wall. Rex breathed. Somewhere below the ridge in the camp, a door opened and closed, someone stepping out to check the sky, perhaps, or to stand for a moment in the open air with the specific gratitude of a person who has been enclosed for 6 days and is rediscovering what it means to have more space than the body requires. The sound carried up in the still air and arrived at the rail car's iron side as something barely above silence. The river stones held their warmth through the night. They would still be warm at 2 in the morning when Agnes's hand dropped automatically from the platform edge to the nearest stone surface, confirming the system's status in the dark by touch alone, finding it as she had left it. They would be warm at dawn, diminished, but not spent still carrying what the fire had given them the day prior, storing it with the patient, indifferent reliability of dense matter that simply cannot be rushed into releasing what it holds. She had not outthought winter. She had never tried. She had built a room that stopped feeding it, then lived inside that room while winter said everything it had to say. And when winter was finished, she was still there. The mountain held its cold around the railcar, deep and ancient and absolute. Inside 8 feet of wool and wood and trapped air, the heat remained. So did she.